This is Matthew Minard for the American Maritain Association with Maritain Musings, a new podcast and YouTube channel video where we're going to gather from our Rolodex at the American Maritain Association to discuss both texts and themes from the works of the French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. So today, I have with me here Dr. Gregory Kerr, an associate professor of philosophy at DeSales University in Center Valley, Pennsylvania. Dr. Kerr is here to talk with me today about a well-worn book on my shelf. I don't know what yours is like, Gregory, but The Degrees of Knowledge.
Yeah, it's falling apart.
Oh, that's a good sign. I mean, I have in my copy at a certain point in graduate school, I realized I had read through it so many times that it was helpful sometimes to see what I had not underlined. Um,
Yes,
I've got whole sections, that are overly underlined, multiple versions, and so
sure.
forth. So it's a big text. In these interviews, I'm going to try to not take over like I do with a lot of things. So I'm going to ask a series of questions about the work, and we'll just discuss a bit for an hour, the text. So why don't you just say something to begin here about yourself first, just
hmm
to give our listenership and viewership a little bit of information about you, and then your own connection to Maritain. So before we get to the book, just like let's situate you as someone who's interacted with his works.
Sure. Actually, I'm associate professor of philosophy here at the Department of Philosophy and Theology at DeSales University. Love it. Love being here. It's a great group of people, and they really love the church and the gospel. But basically, with regards to Maritain, uh, that the first thing I would say is that initially, I'm embarrassed to say, when I was at Fordham and was reading things for International Philosophical Quarterly, and someone had called Maritain the Prince of Thomism, I laughed. So such has been kind of the report about him. Um, but basically, I've always been interested in aesthetics, art and beauty, and so forth. And my dissertation director at the time at Fordham, Deal Hudson, had persuaded me that if I wanted to do a dissertation on aesthetics, Maritain was the man. And I think he was right. That basically, I found a treasure trove of insight in his aesthetic works. So, um, so basically, that's how I got into it. And Professor Hudson also, brought me into the American Maritain Association, and also encouraged me to do the Maritain Notebook at the time, to revive that. And so I did that for 9 years, and so
Oh,
enjoyed.
so you were so the Maritain Notebook, for those who are coming in not from the association, you're speaking though of the newsletter in the end
Yes.
you do. So yeah, hopefully we're actually in the midst of I have new templating for it. I mean, mostly the same, but I didn't realize I was the inheritor of
Uh,
your
well,
earlier.
there's been a bunch of people that
Yeah, but it
came
was a
around the whole.
DeSales guy. It was before you though. It was one of your colleagues there in
Yes.
philosophy. Yeah, Schultz was that. So.
Yeah.
Um, Well, we have our Dr. John Trapani. I feel like since he's written the book on the aesthetic stuff, when you talked
Absolutely.
about this, I thought, well, I'd like to give you the aesthetic things, but out of politics, we'll have him on hopefully relatively soon.
Well, yeah, he's the man. He's the man.
So, so
He's the
this
man I
also
studied to do my dissertation. So
this makes me wonder before I get to our second question, just a kind of
sure.
sub question. What all have you taught then of Maritain's texts?
What have I taught?
Yeah, for
Oh,
your undergraduate.
that's a good
Yeah.
question. No, basically, I love being here. As I said, the theater majors here to sales, and it comes back. It was basically a theater program developed by the Oblates, and Oblates who are in the grand tradition. And basically, um, I've been able to most of my tenure here every spring to teach aesthetics.
Oh,
So I use creative intuition every spring semester. So
oh
find
wow.
new things all the time. Yeah, it's a joy.
Oh wow, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe because we may do a general thing with John. We may do you for that text if you've taught it that often, because it's a tough text. So
Yes.
to have someone who can crack it open for people, I
Sure.
think this would be very
After Trapani, if you want to get up. Yeah,
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
So that's a brave man. Have you? So then that leads me by way of segue. So that means you've never had to teach the degrees.
I taught the degrees of knowledge as a tutorial for one student who requested it.
Okay, and that
Okay.
seems appropriate, and I think that that is a good segue to the second question
Yes.
because your answer will bear witness to the people who maybe have not read Maritain's
Hmm.
Degrees of Knowledge why maybe only one student would be doing it because of its difficulty. So, just can you give a high level outline of the text for our viewers? Because that's
Well,
part of the
based
purpose here. Yes, to give like an outline of the text for those who are coming in.
Sure. Most of it's in an articular format. They're articles, but the basic structure is basically two parts to it. One is rational knowledge, the knowledge that's suitable to human nature, and then super rational knowledge when you start involving God and the spiritual world. So you've got those two, and then basically he moves through different topics. But that's the basic structure, and that's what he wants to lay out. Okay, a kind of terrain, a kind of map of the different intellectual activities of the human being.
Yeah, so just to maybe break that down and see
Mhm.
what maybe you would say to a viewer who's picking it up. Like when we look at so if you're, let's say you've got your hat on as a philosopher, and you think, well,
Yes,
I'm gonna look at the first half of this book because this whole second half has got all of this super rational knowledge,
right.
theology, John of, St. John of the Cross. Let's just stick to the first bit. That's what I'm going to teach in my class. I'm going to stick it
Yes,
in an epistemology class. And so if immediately though when you drop in, you feel the articles a little bit, right?
yeah,
Because he deals with sciences and the philosophy of nature.
yes,
He deals with, I've got a thumbs up that went up there, I guess. Deals with the question of critical realism, right? That's a whole thing that there's a debate in Thomism at that time about
yes,
whether or not there's a possibility of a critical realism. He comes back to things about our knowledge of sensible nature, and some of that's connected with his philosophy of sciences bit. And then about metaphysics. Um, what would you say, like, out of all of that, like as a professor, maybe
hmm
even, what's most usable, what's the thing that's most interesting, right? Because I'll have my spiel, but each person's going to have their spiel. So, like, what would you?
okay. So basically, um, the uh, the what is interesting about the book is, I mean, the idea that the knowledge. There's so many things that you can, so many ways that you can approach this. But one of the things I think I would really stress is that knowledge is not one kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
There are different ways of knowing, and it's important to discern how these things work. Otherwise, you're going to run into confusion all the time. You're going to expect the poet to think exactly the way the philosopher does. You're going to expect the practical person to think just exactly the way the speculative person thinks. And that's a mistake. And he maps it out. This is how they think. This is how, and these are natural finalities. These are ways that the human mind works. So, first of all, we talk about epistemology, which is the philosophy of human knowledge. And if you look at some of the major philosophers, Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, in the Age of Reason, they're always busy using reason to accomplish something, to make a philosophy and so on. But we get very little, except for perhaps you can argue in Kant. There's quite a bit of buildup there, but the mind itself, and the reality of the mind gets overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interesting thing for me, going back to all this, is saying, look, he's showing you this is what's been overlooked, by the great philosophers of the Age of Reason. That
And would you
so,
even say too? I thought maybe you were going to go this way too. We talk about epistemology, and
yes,
it's very often that set of problems that come downstream of those authors.
yes,
Especially, and this is very strange about Kant actually, because it's usually all about speculative reason, about sort of our knowledge of the external world and how it's possible. But for Kant, it's weird because even for him, practical reason has this very important role.
yes,
And it's usually an epistemology class doesn't teach that.
right,
Whereas this book, as you're saying, it sort of says there are many ways, many modes of objectifying reality.
yes,
One more thing, I didn't have this. It's like, this is what's nice when you're talking to someone who knows the content, right? So before I get to what I told you I'd talk to you about, he talks about speculative stuff and practical stuff, especially the moral life, because of what he wants to do with regard to the questions of contemplation and the stuff from John of the Cross.
Yes.
I've never thought of this until now. Maybe I have in passing, but you're an aesthetics guy. Do you find it weird that he doesn't discuss some of the aesthetic cognition stuff thematically in this book? I've never thought of that until now.
I don't know how much he says. Well, um, yeah, I guess you could have to go back and you look at the different times that he's written major works, Art and Scholasticism, and the three versions of that, and that he's been writing about aesthetics all along. This he doesn't spend too much time here, although you do have this great quote here that signals the differences, and I'll just
Mhm.
read it here. I think because I have it here on the I have written out your questions and tried to figure out how I was going to. Uh, uh, so, any case, but in here, he has pretty much towards the beginning of the book. Okay, uh, he talks about the poet and the metaphysician. So,
Hmm.
with the metaphysician, you can think of the philosophy of nature. You can think of metaphysics, philosophy in general. I think. Um, but he says here that uh, he says here there is a sort of grace in the natural order presiding over the birth of a metaphysician, just as there is over the birth of a poet. The latter, the poet, thrusts his heart into things like a dart or rocket, and by divination sees within the very sensible itself and inseparable from it, a flash of a spiritual light, in which a glimpse of God is revealed to him. The former, this is now the metaphysician, right, turns away from the sensible and through knowledge sees within the intelligible, detached from perishable things, this very spiritual light itself, captured in some conception. The metaphysician breathes an atmosphere of abstraction, which is death for the artist. It's interesting. Imagination, the discontinuous, the unverifiable, in which the metaphysician perishes, is life itself to the artist. While both absorb rays that come down from the creative night, it's very
Yeah,
different.
no, you're absolutely right. I think that actually there's something at that change that exists somewhat between. I mean, it's present in the works around the early editions of Art and
Mm-hmm.
Scholasticism, but the development of poetic intuition, poetic knowledge as the
Yes,
source, especially of the fine arts, is developing in his mind at this point. It
yes,
is present, and it's present there at the beginning. And maybe he just then gets into the things related to the epistemology of the sciences, for instance, because that's kind of the big discussion right then. And then the stuff about mysticism, because Garrigou Lagrange, to whom some of that
yes.
stuff is dedicated, he is doing that stuff there, and so he's kind of he ends up doing those two more. That's an interesting point. It's been a while. That introduction is great.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a while since I've read it, and I remember as a grad student loving it or loving it later on, and I just in my mind like there's stuff in the intro I should go back and appreciate.
Well, yeah, it's a marvelous essay about metaphysics as being such a majestic discipline, but yet it doesn't have the answers to the ultimate questions that it asks. There's a kind of
Yeah,
poverty.
all the stuff about the vision of God is hidden in
Yep.
there in broad daylight. I mean, in broad daylight. Yeah, I remember it as the Majesty and Poverty of Metaphysics. It is such a great opening chapter. Actually, it's such a stirring chapter. But let's make sure I ask you the questions I sent to you
Okay.
because like there are other things blooming in my mind, and I should be fair to you if I actually gave you an outline of hey, let's make sure we're organized.
Oh, that would be nice.
Um,
Yeah, because I've written some notes, and
So yeah,
go
maybe you
ahead.
can tell it's a formidable work, therefore, right? Since we
Yes,
think about the things we've talked about. So someone walked into our talk and they're like, "Wow, these guys are just sort of all over the place." It's like, well, because the book has this stuff that's about his epistemology of poetic knowledge, the all the apparatus of Thomist epistemology and the degrees of abstraction, and what do we
yes,
do about the sciences, etc.
yes.
So it's big, it's formidable. You need a lot of apparatus to understand it. How did you first encounter the book?
I first encountered the book by I felt I knew this was his magnum opus, and I needed to know it. in order to continue with my work on my dissertation on Maritain's aesthetics. I was working on with Deal Hudson. I was working with the conception of the receptive intuition. Of course, we all know creative intuition. There's also a notion in Maritain of the receptive intuition by the auditor, the audience, what's going on in their minds, and so on. So when I went through that, I was looking for things that would help me with that. So
Okay, so it was definitely in graduate school
yes,
in the context of trying to work out his, for lack of better terms, epistemology
yes,
of the artistic.
yes,
Um,
and to see just like in the passages we just read, he really sees them as very, very different. His
yes.
death is, the life, the mindset of the he says of the artist is death.
Yeah, or
He's
vice
very
versa. Yeah.
strong with his language, you know.
hmm Yeah,
So
that's a very important thing to take home from this because it will change how you think about the human mind and its relationship to
yeah,
reality. And once you see that, you see it all throughout him. I think that's a great strength of this vein in him.
sure.
Um, Now you had at the time then, did Deal Hudson help you through the
Yeah,
trudging?
A Maritanian and one of the key members at the time in 1990, 91 of the American Maritime Association.
So
So
he was able to help you trudge through
oh,
them,
huge.
some of the
He
pitfalls.
was
Yeah.
perfect. He was one of the best directors one could have.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Yeah, because that's
yeah.
yeah, I was sort of thrown to the wild by a
Oh
very
yeah.
dear professor who had been my novice master as a monk. But imagine being a seminarian trying to read it
Uh,
by a Jaspers student. So it was not I was
yes, it'd be tough.
yeah, it was tough. So
And there are no helps. One of the great things about this on YouTube is what else is going to, or your podcast. There aren't any podcasts on the degrees of knowledge right now.
yeah. No, no, this is true. Yeah, I'm hoping to take. I'm going to do a little course online on it, and I'm hoping I can take that material and do like a
Yeah.
chapter by chapter. But, um, so yeah, then I think we can answer the other question I asked you is like, what subject was of most interest to you? It was these elements concerning receptive intuition and knowledge and so forth.
Yes.
Yeah. What would you say to someone who might be listening to us right now and they hear our talk about intuition and they know smattering about Maritain? They say, oh, it's a bunch of Bergsonian stuff that's in him.
Yeah. Oh, I would say, yeah. I would first say that, do you know, in fact, that that basically Maritain had inherited the positivistic philosophy from the Sorbonne and felt that he and Raisa, they felt the world was meaningless. They were going to commit a pact 1 year to end it all because there's no meaning to life. Uh, and it was only by going to the l'école, College l'école,
Mhm.
uh, no, I have College de France, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah, the Collège de France. Yeah,
Oh,
that's
okay,
right.
College
Yes.
de France, yeah. And where he's tending a lecture by Bergson, who's talking about no, you can obtain the absolute. You can get to the heart of the matter through intuition.
And so, yes, I always try to tell people then, clearly his epistemology ends up being different because of his critiques of
Yeah,
Bergson. And
sure.
yet and yet there is this deep awareness of the fact that it knowledge is the manifesting of reality to you, and
Yeah,
it's kind of given. I mean, I'm not trying to turn him into sort of, Marion or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah,
But
sure.
there's something he gets, from Bergson that never goes away in the midst of all those
I think
critiques.
so. Yeah.
And I don't think it needs to be taken as a an encumbrance, right? You can take something like that, with critical awareness, and yet, yeah,
I think he's probably most critical of Bergson when you're talking about speculative philosophy, right?
yeah.
You talk about
Speculative
these other
knowledge was
things,
the issue with
right?
it's dogmas. If you
The
remember, he
concept,
says,
you need the concept.
"Yep, exactly."
So,
But once you get into the world of knowledge that's not directed toward conceptual
right.
explication, all of a sudden, at least significant elements of that Bergsonianism at least give you an openness to experience that sometimes rigid Thomism doesn't.
Yes, it does. My dad, Walter Kerr, he was at Catholic University. He taught at Catholic University, and he wanted to, talk with his colleagues there. He wanted to talk about intuition. He said, "This is an intuitive matter of intuiting beauty and so on." But the Dominicans at the time, I think, if I got this right, they didn't want to hear it. I mean, they keep on thinking SCOTUS or something like that.
Yeah,
So when I came home and I said, I'm reading, creative intuition, and he read my dissertation and he commented on it, which was a lovely thing. And one thing he was really happy about was, hey, the Thomists are, embracing intuition.
yeah. Well, that was he was there during, I mean, he would have experienced the last bits of an era too of CUA philosophy was not very open to
Mm,
Maritain, for instance. He was like persona non grata, probably partially because of theology as well, this church state stuff. But
uh,
anyway, have a different guy on for that.
yes.
Okay, so let's just drill down into the chapters. So
Sure.
I'm just going to circle back around to the teacher and me, just to tell, again, someone's listening. The book is laid out like Dr. Kerr had mentioned. You've got sort of supernatural knowledge, theology, mysticism in the second half, first half, natural knowledge, and he works through questions of philosophy of nature, the problem of knowledge itself, the sciences, metaphysics. So let's start with like the questions of what we call today like the philosophy of science, or probably more appropriately for him because of the Thomist tradition of philosophy of nature, which figures centrally in several points of this text. So can you just tell our listenership something about Maritain's engagement in questions related to the philosophy of nature?
Well, the philosophy of nature for Maritain, he says in a number of places, it's kind of an extension of metaphysics. And so if you think of philosophy of nature, you think of, getting at, through concepts, the nature of things, the essences of things. You're asking the question, quid est? What is it? And that's a very special thing for Maritain because you're doing metaphysics, but you can know the nature of things and human beings, as opposed to, let's say, science, scientific practices, the experimental sciences and so on and so forth, physics. That's not going on. It's something different. They start. So philosophy of nature, you start with a sensible sensory experience, and then you're able to abstract to see into it the nature of the thing, which is a universal object. All right, and it's separated from the physical world, and you understand what the nature of the thing is. Um, with science, as he understands it, with contemporary science, quantum mechanics, things have changed. Not that they can do away with essences and natures and things like that, but that they grab a hold of something in the physical world, sensory data, and then they work with that and they resolve their judgments in the sensible data. They don't desire to pull it out.
Mm-hmm.
So you have, the search for laws, relationships between events and things like that. And so the essences are still there, but they're not alluded to. They're seen, he says, obliquely.
Mm-hmm.
And even sometimes he talks about science actually providing us or providing themselves with some kind of mythology
Mm-hmm.
in which they work and they get their mathematical descriptions and things like that and test things that way.
Yeah,
So go ahead.
I'm surprised too when you say that. There are those wonderful passages where he talks about how the notion of space and time and chance,
Mm-hmm.
they're actually different for the scientist and the natural
Yes,
philosopher.
yes, absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's one of the big sin would be for for a scientist after doing science very, very well and legitimately and all that to start making philosophical pronouncements.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we see this all over the place. Um, and the philosophers probably shouldn't be going the other way, but like, for example, I think of in biology, and this is not something Maritain says, but Gould, um, um, and Gould says, okay, in the Rocks of Ages, okay, he says he has this idea there are different methods to knowing. He's got it. He's got the idea there's difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then he begins to discuss, what's in each category. That's called noma, non-overlapping magisteria. Okay, so you see things, different camps, different magisteriums, mysteria, excuse me, where people see things in a different light. But then he goes on to go back to the scientific and says, okay, scientists have the world of facts, and the religious people have the world of values. You
Like,
can't live in that world, right?
it's,
Right. So,
yeah. One of the now you hit something else, and I don't know if you remember this, if it sticks out or not, but if you read the volume from a few years ago that we did where Michael Torre wrote the essay on facts,
uh-huh.
that's a great section in this book where Maritain talks about how there are different facts
Yes.
with different mode for different basically for different kinds of abstraction. So the
Yes.
scientific fact, he has an essay on organisms about this. Like whenever the zoologist considers the fact, it's different than the natural philosopher doing the de anima.
Absolutely. They
Yeah.
can't, and really, the zoologist can't come over and say, "I really want to be with you, philosophers." They really have to keep to the method that they're using. So it's
Yeah, exactly. Because you have to kind of change your discourse. So
yes,
the zoologist must leave zoology, redefine the facts. You look at them again under a new light.
yes,
You define them anew, and then you're in a different epistemological mode to do the
yes.
philosophy of nature. They're not closed off from each other, but you need to do this kind of like this change of perspective. Yeah, yeah.
Now I
Very.
find,
That's
go ahead.
no, it's very important stuff. Go on.
But there's another way of looking at that is I think of what Schrodinger has written. Okay, one of the great quantum mechanics physicists, and basically, uh, what he says is that he says this, and I'll quote it. It's worth quoting, I think here. We human beings, human persons, we do not belong to the material world that science constructs for us. So at the end of the day, we think we live in the scientific world. We don't. We're not in it, which I think is interesting,
Mhm.
right? We're not in it. We're outside. We're only spectators. The reason why we believe we're in it is that we believe that we belong to the picture is that our bodies are in the picture. And the reason for this disconcerting situation is just this, that for the purpose of constructing the picture of the external world, we have used the greatly simplifying device of cutting our own personality out of it. Hence, it's gone, it's evaporated, it's not needed. And
Mhm.
there's an example. Here's the scientific mode. He's doing a good job. He's legit. This is scientific, and it gives okay. But in that world, in that language, we don't exist. We're not
Yeah.
in it.
But I think
Right?
there's operative there. The natural philosopher has like hovered over the science then to sort of at least like somewhat float at the top of science to be like,
Uh-huh.
so here is where you're setting your boundaries. You can't do
Yes.
anything else, but you can set
Yes.
your boundary.
Yes.
Yeah. That's why he says in that little book, and then we'll move on because it's not about the natural philosophy. That book on natural philosophy even says it's the metaphysics. It's not really metaphysics in the strict sense, but it's the
Right.
metaphysics that fits our mind and the proper object of our intellect because we have to start there because we start in sensation. And so it kind of plays the immediate role between metaphysics in the kind of totally separate sense and physical realities.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's great stuff. And I can feel myself. Like I said, the school marm in me wants to talk. But so to keep myself from doing that, we'll go to question two. So
Yes.
4B, if you will, in my outline here. So in the background of the work is the whole thing, the Leonine revival after
Can
Pope
I?
Leo
I
XIII.
don't. It's up to you.
Yeah.
I have some notes on your question number 4 that might be helpful. I don't know.
Oh, is this more on A? Because I'm going to B.
Yeah, for A, if
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
all
go
right.
ahead. Oh, absolutely. Keep going through. Just
And
keep
then
going through.
and then we can drop it if we want.
No, no, keep going through. That's great. Because I got, yeah, go through your stuff you have. So that
Um,
same question. I was just jumping to the second sub question.
okay. So I think you have to start with an important principle, and this is for not for you. It's not for the Maritainians. It's for the general viewer who might
Mhm.
stumble on this and still with us. So the things for Maritain and this is a general principle, the things that we experience in the world, the real being, individual beings, they're individuals and they're constantly changing. But science is of the universal. So once we say we know something, we're talking about something universal. Okay. Now for Maritain, the philosophy of nature, is an extension of metaphysics. The domain seeks after and grasps abstractly and in immaterial fashion, apart from the sensible world, the essential natures of things and the causes of their existence and how they all fit together. Scientific practice, on the other hand, begins with the individual sensible realities and terminates them as well. They know they have to work with the natures of things, but they approach them obliquely, as we said. So science is an important mode of reasoning, but we should never confuse it with metaphysics or philosophy. You must distinguish to unite. So actually, now I'm reading this, I'm thinking, we covered this.
Good to have it in an outline, though. Someone
Okay.
stumbled in. That's great.
Okay. Well, good. Thank you.
Yeah. And then to tip our hat to Jack Cahalan,
Yes.
that essay by Yves Simon is very good for people to get introduced to this. Maritain's philosophy of the sciences.
Right.
Basically, it just plays out what you just said. So that's a great outline. I think that's actually very helpful for someone.
Okay.
Just stumbling in. So is that it for your
That's
reporting? Okay, good. Make sure I didn't have you prepare and then you didn't get to use your preparation. Now B. So we'll go to 4B. So in the background of the book, especially, I mean, it's throughout, but chapter 3, where he talks about critical realism, you can feel the Leonine revival after Aeterni Patris, the encyclical by Leo XIII, bringing the whole kind of Christian philosophy, rebirth of a neo-scholasticism, as some people will speak. And one of the big problems that kind of like everyone is worried about during that period is answering not just Descartes, but Kant and idealism, and dealing with the problem of knowledge in that very modern epistemological way of posing it. And so chapter 3 is kind of dedicated really to that genre. It's kind of an article on critical realism that's based on that. So why don't you just tell our readers, or tell our listeners a little bit about Maritain's critical realism?
Okay. So basically, that I think we can understand the nature and value of realism by contrasting it with nominalism and idealism. Okay. Beginning with nominalism, one can think of William of Ockham in the 14th century, and especially the work of many modern philosophers building on nominalism. The ideal of knowledge here, in many ways, the gold standard of knowledge that they, and many to this day, hold, was that what anyone knew directly were the ideas of things, the concepts of things, and not the things themselves. Maritain, as does Gilson, they call this idealism. Scientific materialism is a fruit of this, where it's thought that the only kind of reasoning is scientific reasoning. Okay, so basically, Maritain is trying to bring back the grand tradition, the perennial tradition. This is Aristotle, St. Thomas, and so on, and basically, he wants to say this is something that's very, very important. So one of the things that can be mentioned with regard to this is that, and this is right at the beginning of his book, right? The first preface, okay, the first edition. And I think the Maritain thinks, and this is huge, that the mind itself has been neglected. Okay, so we've glorified reason. We said it's the age of reason, right? And all that. But somehow the mind has not been looked at directly, has not been explored directly. And so Maritain says the mind is really special. It's really elaborate. It has its own nature. It's really a thing. It has an ontological presence. It's really, and we tend to overlook that. I think of the psalmist. Lord, we are awesomely made. I am awesomely made. And that's really true. And what is it that we're in the image of God in with our minds, right? So, but mind, what is it? The mind, even more so, Maritain says, even more so than the physical world and bodily organisms, the mind possesses its own dimensions, its structure and internal hierarchy of causality and values, immaterial though they may be. You see, they're not, the scientist is not going to see these, right? Science is trying to be objective out there, you know. What about, okay, now here's the critique of idealism, okay, so that we will appreciate realism. Contemporary idealism, in the last analysis, says Maritain, refuses to recognize that mind has any nature or any structure. It sees the mind only as pure movement, pure freedom. Hence, it never really gets beyond spreading it out, whole and entire, upon a single plane of intellection, like a two-dimensional world, infinitely flat. And I thought this was amazing. I kept on thinking, so they're not really getting a hold of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
What they're thinking.
That's
And when
mm-hmm.
you have a realism, and this is what the book is about. Here's the
Mm-hmm.
mind. Here's how it works, so
Mm-hmm.
that you can grab a hold of it. You can appreciate it and work with it, rather than just going up one narrow highway. I suppose
Yeah,
you could sit
you
there.
would say that it's, that in a sense, which is very strange to think of it. It's a very interesting insight that although modern epistemology is, we think of it as study of mind, although, right, science is what it comes from.
Yeah.
It's like I said, it's, if anything, whatever we can say, whatever, if we want to be in a positive mood, it's more about, reasoning than it is about the very mode of like the phenomenon of what is mind.
Yes.
In Thomas will tend to register this back into being, but it's like intentional
Yes.
existence is what this is. What is mind in its intentional existence?
Yeah.
Man, that's would you say, I would think that is on the border between a kind of classic Thomist ontological look at reality, kind
Yeah.
of the metaphysical mind, right? The Thomists are always going in that direction. And then what, funny enough, for all of his critiques of Husserl in a little section here, it's on the edge of what phenomenology wants to do as well, though. Phenomenology does something much more kind of grounded in sort of expositing the appearance of the phenomena of various kind, but the being of the mind. You can feel elements of like Brentano in that. He's not necessarily pulling on it, but it's the same problem. It's the same issue.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that very
That's
interesting. I
why
never
I
thought.
think Gilson was very skittish,
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
when Maritain called it critical realism,
Mm-hmm.
Gilson was kind of wanted to back off. You want to pay too much attention to the mind,
Yeah.
and its propensities, But I think
The
it's so important,
mm-hmm.
Is there a way that the mind naturally works, and different, and does it have different languages? Does it have a different? And Maritain says it does. And if you realize that, there's a lot of people you can appreciate that you might not have been able to appreciate before.
Yeah, you see what they're at least incipiently getting. The
Yeah.
phenomenon that they're getting at is this experience of what mental being is, really.
Mhm.
That Gilson late, I think it's in the letter from very late in life, like right after Maritain dies. John Dealey liked to cite this thing,
Mhm.
but I had seen it later on, maybe some section John hadn't cited, where Gilson says, he says, in the end, I think that, the whole thing that kind of corrupted Maritain is that he wasn't in the end a philosopher of being, but it was the problem of knowledge that he placed sort of at the center.
Mm.
Yeah, and it was a private letter, as an old man sent. But it shows there was a difference there. That whole issue about critical realism. Funny enough, Garrigou-Lagrange also was, because he was much in Maritain's camp on this. He wrote this very gentle set of articles praising Gilson, but critiquing Gilson's critique of Maritain and a couple of others. Um, so yeah, it's interesting. If in the world of this, it's very Maritainian, this chapter. I just thought of one of
The diagram.
the diagrams of Maritain. He's taught, Dr. Kerr has taught creative intuition, where there's the cones, as
The cones.
you know, uh, John Trapani always likes to refer back to.
Yeah.
But so, is there anything else you want to do for 4B?
4B. Let's see here. Okay. Just a few things, but I don't want to be attentive to time. Realism, on the other hand, okay, we talked about idealism. Realism, on the other hand, is seen in the philosophy of Aristotle and St. Thomas. Okay, hold on one second here. If you
Mhm.
would, just if you hold on one second, I want to make sure that yeah, so okay. Realism, on the other hand, is as seen in the philosophy of Aristotle and St. Thomas, is that and this is a key thing that's important, and I think might address the Gilson critique, which is that knowledge is always a knowledge of something. Instead of Descartes' I think, therefore I am, the realist insists I think, therefore there's being. There's something I'm thinking of. You can't have thought without that connection.
Mhm.
Okay? And I think that's a very important. You can't isolate the mind from the things that it knows. He's not an idealist in that sense, right?
Mhm.
And metaphysics, as I read degrees of knowledge, it's always there. You can't talk about knowledge without
It's
metaphysics.
exactly. It's. I mean, he sees that it's ultimately a question of a way of being. It's all. It's
Yes.
very obvious throughout here.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Um.
okay, so for the realist, you want to know the nature of things, how things are ordered, human nature, how are human beings ordered in their actions in order to thrive. Realism is not a closed logical system, but it's open to and tries to become adequate to grasp the fullness of what's outside of it. Um, there are more things in heaven and on earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. And that's a key thing for me is that, if you're an idealist, you're in a closed system of your concepts, and then you're governed by logic, and then you're caught.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But, with the realist, oh, yeah, we had phlogiston, right? But we don't have it anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
It can be fuller. We know that the world is more than, we grasp the essences of things, but yet there's a richness to reality that is not present in simply the concept.
Yeah, and so that idea of adequating, I once went to a paper once that was very excellent on this. When you think of it verbally, right, it's not just a question of there's a correspondence truth. It's how people tend to think of it. Your mind
Yes, no, you're
corresponds to
right.
reality,
Yes,
right? But it really is through the process of defining and forming propositions and reasosoning. It's
yes,
this work of the mind adequating itself,
yes,
expressing to itself reality. I had
yes.
a friend who said this. And I wonder what you would say. I think you would totally agree. He thought he was being like edgy. And he says, you have to rebuild the world in your mind, in a
Yeah,
sense.
yeah.
And it is, in a sense, you are. You're re-expressing the world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Think of the concepts when I say the word express. I mean, I'm thinking,
No,
um,
yeah. And I think just the whole idea of becoming. Knowledge
mhm,
is becoming.
becoming.
That's the most fun concept because we buy into the lock-in. It's an
Hmm.
empty room.
Yeah.
Or it's a blank slate, and we fill it up with experiences
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
if we're stuffing. It's a
So,
material
yes.
image, but of course, we're talking about something immaterial. You remaining yourself, you become the thing that you know,
Yeah.
and
It's
so
amazing.
that's
I
why
mean,
it's such a challenge, right?
yeah. And that's why, and it's clearly in Maritain here. It's why there's an entirety of metaphysics that's
Mm-hmm.
underneath the hood with all of this. Yeah, and there's that great, we won't be able to talk about it much, but that big like essay he has attached about the concept. Like where
Mm-hmm.
he then does a whole puts his real Thomist hat on and goes through every text to show how this becoming takes place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, yeah. And the only other thing that I'll plug there is that you were talking about oh, now I forget what term you used, but I thought, there's that section on how to have knowledge is always knowledge of reality. There's
Yes.
that discussion of thing and object, which I know that those of
Yes.
us who've been in the AMA, we've heard John Dealey talk about it all the time, but it is super important. The way that an object, to be an
Halen as well.
object,
Yeah.
Cahalan, exactly.
Yeah.
But to be an object is to be a thing as known. And he has a
Yes.
great discussion of that in there. Super important. Anything else on this section?
No, I think we can move on.
Okay.
Giving the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure.
So yeah, let's go. Okay. So it's clearly then. So we were saying like you pick it up, assign it to your epistemology class. You're like, I'm gonna stick in that first section, but it clearly is a work of kind of Christian and Catholic philosophy.
Yes.
Um, so there is interesting stuff in the section on metaphysics and knowledge through analogy. I'm going to
Right.
skim a little bit over it, not
Sure.
because it's just totally standard Thomism, but it is coming out of a certain line that I think many people are familiar with if they've listened to other Thomist things. I mean, it is interesting, but I want us to get into the two things that you would say are your takeaways. You can just do these both together
Sure.
about what he says about theological knowledge and then mystical experience and mystical knowledge in this text, because that's really the whole second half of the book.
Yeah, sure. Well, the theological, I mean, I think as I was thinking about Maritain, I was thinking one of the things that this is important for is the acknowledgement that faith and reason go together. Uh, Currently with scientific materialism, a lot of times you'll have believers of all different denominations, and they'll buy into the scientific picture of the world. And when you ask, well, can you argue for that? And he said, oh, it's a matter of faith, you just believe, and that's where faith comes in. And you feel bad.
Mhm.
Well, no, you don't have to back down and let people walk over you. You reason can actually, mount cases for the causes of things, and ultimately through an analogical predication, analogical knowledge, and we need to use that for our lives. We can get back to that which is right. Get back to God. So that's important. That's critical to understand. The two wings. That's John Paul II image of faith and reason. Two wings on a bird. Um, for the mystical experience, I thought was interesting. We've been talking about the concept the whole time. We've been talking about the universal the whole time. And we were saying that's a kind of a standard for metaphysical philosophy of nature for thinking. Um, but with mysticism, he changes that, you see. Uh, so we want to say, I want to highlight three kinds of knowing. There's speculative knowing, there's practical knowing, and there's knowledge by connaturality. They're all different. All right. The knowledge by connaturality does not use the concept, does not use the universal. It uses emotion, intentional motion used, co-opted by the reason that now becomes intentional. It knows something other than itself, other than what, okay? And so in works of art, we can become aware of things, even though we can't define them, and that's one of the beauties of art. Now, with mysticism, it's also a knowledge by connaturality, and it's not about the concept. It's also intuitive, but the medium, that through which we know, okay? And this is also such an important point, that for standard philosophy, from the Thomistic tradition, this is for all those who are watching, that this concept is not what is directly known. It's that which we know through. Okay, it almost falls into the background, and it shapes how we know something, but it enables us to know something, but it itself is not the term of knowledge, as it is for Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and Kant. And of course, when you do that, what they did, and have your ideas as the term of knowledge, you've got to say, well, how does that, what I know, relate to the world? You have the
You've
problem
got
with the
you
bridge.
immediately got one. Yeah, there are two sides here, and in between, there's just that little gap is enough between my two hands.
Yeah.
You can't jump between them. You're always trying to map. That's the idea of correspondence is effectively buying
Yes.
that problem as
Yes, it
well.
is. I
Setting the
agree. Totally.
problem up. Yeah.
Adequatio is much better. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm going to keep you here because this is great, the stuff about the affect, because this is
Yes.
very important to see then the way, like, to spell out for listeners, because this is not just something like, that Maritain sat around and looked at a bunch of artwork before he moved to America.
Right.
This is coming out of the Thomist tradition of the mystical theology. I mean, John of St. Thomas, Valangera, Joseph the Holy Spirit, like all of these authors, where they talk about how the gifts of the Holy Spirit involve charity
Yes.
passing over to the condition of functioning like an object, that it specifies the mind,
Yes.
and it's what gives this taste, so to speak,
Yes.
right? How the mystics talk about it, this taste that's apophatic, right? This is the
Yes.
apophaticism of the mystics. So maybe just dig a little bit more for our listeners, just so they don't think that this is a bunch of woolly Maritainians. Just, I think I want you to just
I think
give
we
them another flight. Well, we are, but
yeah, but I think that I love the idea. Yeah, not through the concept anymore, so it's well defined, it's organized, it's part of a philosophy, and all that kind of stuff. but you know through God's love directly. So it's his love in the Saint John of the Cross, Catherine of Siena, that you know about God in the world. And it's a different language that comes out. So if you look at, say, Saint John of the Cross and you know the whole the Dark Night of the Soul, it's like romantic poetry. And Lorena McKennitt has a song of Dark Night of the Soul, and it's one of the most romantic things I've ever read or ever heard. It's beautiful, Lorena McKennitt. But in any case, you know, you read it and say, what's this? What's he talking about? You know, because sometimes the words don't make sense in an ordinary common sense or theologically expostulation,
Hmm.
whatever you want to call it. But if you're coming from the same tradition or participated, you know something's going on here. And let me
Hmm.
give you, perhaps giving an example from a thing that's more popular. There's a song by Michael Card. I don't know if you've ever heard of Michael Card. It's called God's Own Fool. And it's about how Jesus played the role of the fool. Like God chose what's foolish in the world to shame
Hmm.
the wise, you know, Paul.
Yeah.
And it's all about Christ playing the part of a fool and so on. And if you think about it just speculatively, it would be heresy. It would be just blasphemous. God's not a
Hmm.
fool, you know.
Hmm.
If you enter in, you know, and know through God's love, and people could disagree if this is a good example or not,
Sure.
you understand what he's saying.
Yeah.
You know what I
This
mean?
is very important because there's something in here. I can't remember the lines of it right now that Garrigou takes
Yes.
about how the vocabulary of the mystic,
Yeah.
how it's loftier and different from the
Yes.
vocabulary of the theologian.
Yes.
And there's this
Yeah.
wonderful vein that goes through Maritain, Journet, Garrigou, and then Labordette writes an excellent article on basically the epistemology of mysticism that comes out of this tradition.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. And that's a great example of what we've said the whole way through. You have to get in that perspective, so to speak.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it just doesn't make any sense, you know.
Yeah. The non-mystic does not have the ear.
No.
And hence, and this is occasioned, it's occasioned heresy, but it's also occasioned misunderstanding and condemnation. John of the Cross took a long time for people to be comfortable with and
Yes.
want a spirituality.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that same period there were the quietist controversies and all that. And you feel under the hood, of course, we're talking about this and the role of, concepts and everything. There's a whole debate that's underneath the hood though, where he's engaging with Gardet about splitting hairs about this topic
Mhm.
because of some things that where he agrees with Garrigou. But that's me planting a seed for someone. If you're out there doing stuff on mystical experience, don't overlook the Gardet thing at the end because it's just an example of how this book is a mine for all these topics. Before we do those last two, just one quick thing. If you have nothing to say about it, 'cause this is more a moral thing, but I was deeply, deeply, deeply influenced by Appendix 7 of this book on
Oh.
the speculative and the practical. That
Oh.
section on, moral knowledge. He takes the language of the later school where he talks about the speculatively practical, the way that even moral philosophy is already kind of turned in this practical direction in an important way. If you have nothing to say, that's fine. I just thought it's a really important section, I think.
Appendix 7. Well, I don't, what I can share with you is, I mean, I'm not I don't quite remember Appendix 7, but I think what he says about the speculative and the practical is amazing. And if you permit me,
Yeah.
there's a passage in The Peasant of the Garonne. Okay.
Oh yeah, I'll let you. Yeah, I'll give you for the podcast version of this. I'll give you cover.
Okay.
So for those of you, if you're only on the podcast while Dr. Kerr is getting his book, you're not going to be able to see this. But the reason this is very important to me. You'll see on the video. I've got all kinds of underlines in this thing. I've read and reread. I think both of my editions. I've got two editions of it are just as underlined as this. Super important
Okay.
section. There are a lot of discussions about the natural law and everything would just benefit from people, um, taking a look at that appendix. But I'm just giving you, Gregory, I'm just giving you cover so that
Right.
so
Okay.
as
Well,
you're,
right now I can't, I don't know where it is,
That's fine.
but he talks about, and it'd probably be better if I summarize it anyway, but the idea is this, that the speculative writer, and he calls the theologian, and the saint
Hmm.
speak different languages.
Hmm.
The saint might say that he needs to hate the world, right, in order to love God.
Hmm.
He hates creatures or whatever, denying the flesh and all that kind of stuff. When the speculative, the theologian, can't say that
Hmm.
because it means that God created junk. He made a mistake. So the theologian would have to say all things are good in their very nature. God created that way, okay? But the saint always considers everything in relationship to himself and his ultimate goal. And
Hmm.
so things get changed.
Hmm.
Augustine is different than Aquinas.
Hmm.
Augustine, the chapter on Augustine talks about practical wisdom.
Yep.
He's a pragmatist. He wants to bring people to a knowledge of God. Okay, and things are going to look different.
And the same thing with John of the Cross.
Yes.
That's part of that whole part is that same point applied. What you said, I think that those
Yes.
same points he makes
Hmm.
in there, just to, yeah, you could have flipped. I'm saying you could have maybe flipped to the degrees and found a similar quote. Or I think
Yes.
he uses some example just like that.
Sure.
Yeah,
Mhm.
this is a very important point.
Yes. Yeah,
And I think,
because they don't. Yeah, sometimes the two don't understand each other. I
yeah,
don't see what you talk all the stuff you talk about hating the world and all that kind of stuff, and the things that Christ has said in the Gospels. How do you make sense of that?
yeah.
Well, they're different languages. They're different.
Yeah,
You're
the other example too is John of the Cross because it's non-knowing,
yeah.
but the theologian comes in and says, no, 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 it's actually the most actuating,
Yes.
right? Because God is pure act, and that's what's going on with grace, right?
Yes.
But they
Yes.
go
Yes.
cross hairs, right? And this is like, think about me being a Byzantine. You can see how many East-West conversations kind of get off kilter because the mystical vocabulary is strong, is like kind of the primary language often in the Byzantine
Yes.
East,
Hmm.
even though the theological language exists, but it's secondary, and it's kind of vice versa sometimes in the West, just because of the effects of the Reformation and this sort of need to respond. Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, that's great. No, that's a great thing. I think maybe if we want to lead people with like a key to that last section, that might be the place to leave it because that's just it's worth trudging through 250 pages for that.
Sure.
So then I think we can get pretty readily to the fifth question. So what would you say is the enduring significance of the work for today's intellectual and spiritual world? Like, in other words, why should people today want to read the book?
Right. Okay. Sure. Okay. So this is what I would like to leave. Okay. Um, so I want to say that again, the three. I want to focus on three kinds of knowledge: speculative, practical, and knowledge by connaturality. Okay. Um, I think it's helpful to note that they're different, really different, and each are legitimate forms of knowing. I think that is really helpful to know. Um, One, if you study or read the history of philosophy and you know what Maritain says, you can figure out why the speculatively minded St. Thomas thought you could demonstrate the existence of God, right? And why Soren Kierkegaard and Blaise Pascal, who are both practically minded, did not. Pascal, it's the wager. He thought reason could go both ways. He is one of the child of this idealistic tradition. I mean, he's a modern, right? But that you can see how the difference makes.
Mm-hmm.
You can read. There's a second benefit. You could read the beginnings of the scientific revolution and the beginnings of modern philosophy, and see how thinkers like Francis Bacon, father of the modern inductive method, and Rene Descartes despised speculative reasoning. They trash it. Okay, and they embraced only practical reason. We need to get moving here. We need
Mm-hmm.
to have some profit. And this bias is going to continue on. It tells me where my mind is going. It's kind of archaeology of the mind. Why am
Mm-hmm.
I sort of thinking in certain ways? Um, And this would also lead to the absence of any substantial ontological view of the human power of reasoning itself. Okay, so we overlook what's most important in us, and this book would remedy that a little bit. And I have a quote from Saint Augustine, that I think is wonderful, from the Confessions, Book 10. Here are men who go afar to marvel at the heights of mountains, the mighty waves of the sea, and the long courses of great rivers, the vastness of the ocean, the movement of the stars, yet leaving themselves unnoticed.
Mm-hmm.
And you go, wow, yes. From his point of view, Augustine, what's inside is greater, right?
Mm-hmm.
The terrain inside
Mm-hmm.
is tremendous. And I think this is one of the things that the book can help us. The view that we have inherited is the view that the reason is infinitely flat, has no structure to it. So we have no substantial and ontological understanding of our own reasoning. We have lost our minds, philosophically speaking.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Our minds have philosophically disappeared. And you even get Charles Taylor, Sources of the Self. Wonderful chapters on Descartes, Locke. He says, for Locke, the self, the reasoning self, is but a point.
Right.
A point.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the reasoning is the most important part of us. And so just to end my shtick, if I can, for me, the great irony of the Age of Reason was to the degree to which it, on the one hand, exalted the life and practice of reason, while on the other was the degree to which it denigrated it. Thinkers praised the spirit of reason, all the while they were claiming that its actual ontological reality was lifeless. It wasn't a living thing. It's mechanical. It's insignificant. It was as if a Faustian bargain was made, and we sold our souls in exchange for masterful knowledge of the physical world. We would increase our ability to quantify and control the physical dimensions of our world, but at the same time lose the ability to know our own souls, the subject who was actually doing all of this stuff. So that's really kind of the big plug for this book, is take the time. It's hard work, you know, but take the time to see how magnificent and varied, you know, I don't know how you want to put it, complex. I hate the word complex, but, you know.
But to have, to gain a sensitivity of insight or intuition, but also insight.
Yes.
To see both the phenomena of these different kind of knowledge. So in your experience,
yes,
that they're different. And then also thereby, though, to see that these various refractions of kinds of knowing,
yes,
are what define what you are as an active agent, as a spiritual agent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it enables you to have the eye to see it. I mean, that's just my way of just rephrasing.
Yes.
For hopefully to help the listeners.
Nicely done. Yeah.
I think that is exactly, I think you hit it right in. That's a great way to sell this. So in order to not put too much snow on the bell so that it can keep ringing, anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
I think that's it.
Okay.
It's one of those things you can go on and on, but no, I think that's basically it, you know.
Yeah, I think that's good. So go get it. It's only technically in translation, it's like, I think the French is like 800 or 900 pages, but it's only 500 pages. Take your time, go through it. Well, we thank you, first of all, Dr. Kerr, for coming here today. And also, too, we thank you from the American Maritain Association, of which both of us are members. So this has been Maritain Musings, today with Matthew Meinert as the host. And the post-production work is done by Mr. Michael Hall, whose work we appreciate as well on behalf of the American Maritain Association. And we look forward to being present for a lot of other episodes in the future. So thanks for coming to our flagship episode.